Hey guys, welcome back to Beginner's Guide to restoring classic lacquer TV and radio cabinets, the type used in the 30s through the 50s. We started in the first installment refinishing this guy, which is an 8-inch Motorola 9VT1. It is a mahogany veneered cabinet. We stripped it and did a repair on it. By the end of this installment, it's going to be looking like this. Just did a final wipe down with lacquer thinner. Again, if this was really raw wood, I would recommend use a sanding sealer. There are a lot of them on the market now. Spray, brush on, water-based, solvent-based, brush on, spray it on, light sanding, but we're just going to go right with the grain filler. So I scoop some out. So it's this sludgy stuff. Looks like thick brown paint. Mix it up a bit. Going to use a cheap chip brush, 2-inch, and dip some in and start smearing it around. Looks like I'm making a horrible mess and ruining things, but we'll be scraping most of this off. And yeah, I know that there are clear grain fillers out there now and other alternatives, and I've heard that way back when they used like plaster of Paris and linseed oil and whatnot. I actually tried that one. I tried pumice in linseed oil, and it was a horrible, messy disaster. So I'm going to stick with this stuff. Alright, cool. So we just let that sit a while, and as it starts to set up, we scrape off the excess, and I often use an expired plastic card of some sort, and just start doing that. Now if you do it too early, like I'm doing now, the stuff does shrink as it sets up, and we have to do a second pass, so I'm going to wait a bit longer. If you need to thin it down as the solvents evaporate, mineral spirits or paint thinner will work just fine with the Mohawk product. Speaking of grain filler, it's been a day and a half since I applied it. We got some crazy hot, humid weather, so it's been taking a while for it to set up. And I left it on kind of thick. Well, if you don't put it on thick enough, you probably end up having to do a second pass. If you put it on too thick, then either it's going to look terrible or you have to remove the excess. Well, because it's a small cabinet, I don't mind removing the excess. Simple way to do it is our old friend, the scraper. And especially if it's a pretty flat cabinet. If it's wavery, well, you probably would have dealt with that when you were stripping it. But that's more how it should look when it's properly grain filled. It's not going to look like mud, but it should be a little bit darker, and all these pits should have picked up the filler, but you still want some of the wood to show through, of course. That feels really nice. After this, scrape off the excess. I'll let it breathe for a while, because when you scrape off the surface, you expose the stuff underneath. Let that fully set up, because if it doesn't fully set up, it's going to shrink on you. So if you rush these stages, it's all about surface prep. In the early stages especially, spend all your time on this. When you get to the point where you're spraying on finish, it's easy. You're just spraying it on. But any defects that are in it are going to telegraph through. And you don't want to have to be doing repairs or touch-ups at the end. Deal with everything now. So we want this to be as perfect a surface as we can make it. After this, when I scrape off the excess, let it set up, we're going to spray it with shellac. It's a universal sealer, sort of. And then light sanding. If there are any little voids, the shellac should fill them in, then we can lightly sand it, and that'll prep it for doing lacquer. Could you put lacquer right over this? Possibly, but Few things. One, lacquer is picky. It does not stick to contamination. What kind of contamination I'm talking about? Well, the biggest culprit is silicone oil. Some furniture polishes, like Pledge especially, they have silicone oil in them. And that, if it gets through the finish and soaks into the wood, will stay there, and lacquer will not adhere to it. You'll end up with what they call fish eyes, because the silicone oil will be lurking in the pits in the grain, and it will, the lacquer will flow away from it. It's like trying to mix oil and water. They don't like each other. Shellac will go over just about anything, and you can seal in that contamination, and then just about anything goes on top of shellac. It's called a universal sealer. You put polyurethane, you can put polyacrylic, you can put lacquer, you can put more shellac over shellac. So that's what I recommend. Now, shellac, a lot of the old timers, they get it in flake form. It's what the heck? I think it's made out of bug poop or something like that from the lac beetle. Thank goodness it's still available and still being made, because it is a really old-timey thing, and it's organic, it's harvested from nature. You can buy it in flake form, and then you dissolve it with alcohol, booze, and then apply it. The problem is, I've never found it in flake form that's clear. It's typically amber or orange tinted. Just beware, if you get that type, it's going to add some color to this. I get spray Zinsser. I think the only one that makes shellac, spray shellac anymore. It just comes in an aerosol can and it's clear and dries in minutes, just like it says on the can. But if it's humid, it can take a bit longer. The general rule is with any of these, be it grain filler, shellac, lacquer, if you can still smell the solvents, it's not ready yet. So when you spray on the shellac, it smells like alcohol. I mean, it smells like tequila, or actually, it smells more like beer. It smells like cheap beer. When you basically can't smell that odor anymore, you're ready for the next step. If it's a really hot, like say 85, 90 degree day with 20-30% relative humidity, it will dry in minutes. But when it's like it is here now, 90% humidity, it might take a few days. So this whole process may take me a week if the weather cooperates. If it was even more cooperative, like I said, like 90 degrees, 20% humidity, I could probably do this in 2 days. But it being humid, probably take me a week, 10 days. Anyways. So since I did this repair and I did things out of order, I have to put grain filler on this area, and this is going to take a day or two to set up. But meanwhile, I can prep the rest of the surface. So I'm just going to scrape off that excess. Notice how it's banded a little. That's because the surface is not perfectly flat. Sometimes I'll take the blade or scraper, bend it a little. I imagine some of you are thinking, why don't I use a much wider scraper? Wouldn't it make things go faster? Not necessarily. This is a really good illustration of the issues you may very well encounter. Even with this small of a scraper, this is what's happening. The surface is not perfectly flat. So imagine the wider and wider this is, any low spots are not going to get scraped. At least with the small blade, I can flex it enough between my two hands that I can get the valleys. This is also why I generally don't use power tools too much. If I do need to sand or scrape, follow the undulations of the old wood. I prefer using just my hands and hand tools. Alright, our goal is to get something looking like this area. I just finished, that's where our patch is. Blended in quite nicely. Now where it's really bad is on this curve here, where I have so much excess. And see, my sandpaper starting to get clogged up. What grit? 220. 220 is kind of the universal choice. I wondered for a long time, why 220? I just found out not too long ago a pretty darn good reason why 220 is so common. And that is because when you're putting on finish and you're between coats, you want to rough it up a little bit before you put on the next coat so it can adhere to it. You don't want a super smooth surface or the next layer can, well, not bond very well. And they've determined that 220 is a really good compromise between, you want to sand out like any fuzzies, any defects, but you also want to make it rough so that the new finish can bond to it. And they figured the 220 works quite well in that regard. That's why you often see on a can, be it spray paint, polyurethane, whatever, you use 220 between coats. Well, that's why. Turns out it's a pretty good choice for doing this too. 320, 400 work okay too, but when it's on really heavy, 220 will get the job done faster. It's not clogging up too bad. Sandpaper I like to use is 3M stuff, the purple stuff. It doesn't clog as readily as some others. And the back has got a, well, I say durable backing, it's got a little bit of a grip to it too. With all these curved and uneven surfaces, I don't recommend you use a sanding block because you're just going to screw it up. Right there, just about done in this little area. How do you know when you're done? Well, when it kind of looks like this. When you can see the wood, but it's darkened because it's filled in, and if you feel it, it's smooth. When when you're not done, when it looks, well, like mud, when you can visibly see the grain filler on the surface. Yeah, see, it starts to accumulate the grain filler, and you sometimes flick it out. Like I said, I think there's actually a tool or something that unclogs sandpaper. I do not have one. Sandpaper's crazy expensive, but it's annoying to have to constantly tear off another piece. Alright, so we're just about done in this little area here. If you take off too much, it's not the end of the world. Just take your can, pop it open, get a little bit of the grain filler out, take your credit card, and just work it in. You have to wait for it to set up, of course. There are some areas where there's dings. I have not completely filled them in. If you fill in dings with grain filler, one, the thicker you put the grain filler, the longer it takes to dry up, and it shrinks a little bit as it dries. You have to put on multiple layers. But also you're going to end up with a big dark spot, which will actually make the defect stand out even more. Same with wood filler. Even if it's a good color match, you won't see any grain in it. You're just going to see a blob where you put the wood filler in. If you really wanted to make it invisible, well, you use light colored wood filler and then use your artistic abilities to dimple it and put in some darker colors and sort of draw the grain in. But for small defects, I'm not going to do that. Plus, it's old, it's got some character. I'm not trying to make it flawless. Tell you what though, it can get a little obsessive if you're a detail-oriented person, because the better you make it, the more you want to make it even better. So you can start off by saying, oh, I don't mind a few dings and I just want to make it look better. But what happens, at least what happens with me, is as I get it making look, just like with that patch. Initially, I was just going to leave the old patch in there, but no, I'm going to do a better job than that. And now, you can get obsessive about this with making it absolutely a flawless surface. I'll leave it up to you how much effort you want to put into it. And you'll see when I'm done, what the final results look like. And, if you don't desire quite that level, well, by all means, you can do less of this. Or more. Reality is this will sit on a shelf somewhere, and probably not a whole lot of people are going to see it, but maybe I'll sell it someday, and who knows where it'll end up. But it's nice to take pride in your work, I think. for the satisfaction of doing a good job. We're getting there. Oh, and of course, always go with the grain. Going with the grain does increase your chances of pulling out the grain filler, but if you go against it, you're going to leave horrible horizontal marks. That'll be very obvious, so don't do that. It's a nice day, so I brought the cabinet outside, get a much better look at it. If you really want to look for any defects, do it in bright outdoor lighting. So anything you can see out here will be far less visible inside. So here it is, after removing the excess grain filler and spraying shellac. Now some areas like this, it got dinged here. It's why there are a couple dark marks, and it's actually a bit lower. So I've been having some trouble kind of working in that area. And generally any area that's dark, it's where it's more depressed, so it didn't get scraped and as much as other areas. And also these sides where it's curved are a real pain. All that being said, this is pretty darn good. And it's unfortunate you get kind of this line here. Also keep in mind, this is an inexpensive cabinet. This is a budget set, so it's not the highest quality woodworking. So it's another reason it's not entirely flat and even all around. So I mentioned about how you can tell if you did a good job of the grain filling or not. Well, aside from just feeling it, kind of getting down and looking, if you take some sandpaper and do this, any areas where you didn't get it that are depressed will be shinier. It's tedious, not much fun to do. And I know I said we were going to avoid doing much sanding, but this is one surefire way to tell. Because where it's level, of course, it's getting scratched up by the sandpaper, but a depressed area will still be shiny because the sandpaper didn't hit it. We're looking pretty good now. I am going a bit farther than I normally would because I want to show you guys what you can achieve if you really go all out. I haven't finished sanding the whole thing with this area in particular. I see a little glint here and there, but I don't even know if I can pick any up on the camera. It's pretty darn good. Now what I'm going to try to do is spray on the toner all in one shot. I thought at first I might want to mask off and do the hardwood separate from the veneer area, but in the sake of taking advantage of the good weather, I'm going to try to do it all in one shot now. Back then, people were very good at doing this. They learned the pattern to do to spray stuff on, just like if you see robots spray paint on a car body. I mean, if you know the right spray pattern, you won't get areas that have too much or too little, or we get runs or drips or whatever. Hey, while I'm working on this, I also brought out this cabinet, and I'm going to briefly talk about another technique that I use all the time, which is to not strip it, not refinish it, but to spruce this up. So this is a Zenith porthole, and this got pretty abused. Somebody had just painted on like brown, flat brown house paint, enamel and latex on the top. Probably was damaged, and I heard this was rented out as a prop for plays or something, so that we didn't care too much. The top I did strip and refinish because it was just a disaster. The sides, though, some paint that was slopped on a little bit more on the other side, but otherwise they're in pretty good shape. But alligatoring, a little bit of chipping here and there, but not too bad. So what I do in this case is I do not strip. What I do is take 400 or 320, or maybe even 220 grit, and lightly sand the surface. And see how it's this color? That's not the toner lacquer I'm talking about. That's what happens with 70, 80-year-old lacquer. It gets kind of yellowy, and there's probably some dirt and grime on it too. I didn't bother cleaning this. So what does this do? It removes the topmost layer and gets rid of alligatoring, gets rid of surface contamination, but does not take out the color, does not take out the grain filler that makes the surface smooth. What I'm doing over that is some ultra classic brown mahogany, same stuff we're going to use on this. Like I said, they all kind of were the same color back then. And then either semi-gloss or gloss. We're going to use gloss on this. but I'm going to use semi-gloss on this guy because it's old and I don't want it to be shiny. You can see how this old, dull this old finish is. So one thing I want to touch on, I got a few comments on about weather conditions when you spray lacquer. We'll talk about it more in that cabinet, but since I'm doing it right now, we'll talk about it right here. Ideally, 75, 80 degrees with like 40% humidity would be fantastic. Stuff would set up, spray on perfectly. Today it's more like 80 degrees, 75% humidity. What can happen with that is you get blushing. As the lacquer thinner evaporates, it cools the surface. It can cause moisture to condense. It gets trapped in the lacquer. You get a cloud. There are products, blush remover, which you can spray on afterwards, which will release the moisture, dissolves the finish a little bit. Do it with the surface horizontal so you don't get any runs. But I haven't been having any trouble. I think it's because I'm doing light passes. Hold the can about a foot away, move at about this pace, a few inches apart, do 2-3 light passes, and it just hasn't been an issue for me. So anyways, I'll show you what the result is of me doing this. Just going to be doing this over the whole surface, not much more than that. Wipe off all the dust and then just overspray it. Alright, that should be good enough. A little more here. Don't worry about getting every little last trace of the old finish off. It'll just melt into the new stuff. Alright, so with the brown right over it. And I don't want to get overspray on the front particularly, so I'm going to spray on this side so the mist goes that way. Obviously, if it's windy, that's going to be a problem. Kind of timing it when there's a lull in the See, there's some areas that didn't get too low because the wind caught it. So I just want to do at least 2 passes to try to even out the color of any spots you might have missed. I'll just do a little of this. Really all there is to it. I just want to move it around a little in the light, check for color evenness. A little challenging because I got a tree above me and I'm getting dappled light on it. Okay. Waited about 5 minutes. I'm going to go with the semi-gloss. Six to 8 inches because it's a little windy. I don't want to spread too far. Got to keep the can moving. Always do a couple passes, try to stagger them, wait for the wind to die down. Sometimes I'll spray in the garage with the overhead door open. Yeah. Even so, fumes can get a little intense in there, so I prefer doing it like this. Oh, wait a minute, and I'll do another final pass. While we wait, time for belly rubs. Alright, that'll do. And there we go. Less than 10 minutes, it's dry. That's why they use lacquer. I think that'll do. Matches the top on the other side. And there we go. Been about 10 minutes, completely dry to the touch. That's why they use lacquer. Sets up so quick, even on a humid day. Pretty good even color. Matches the top, matches the other side quite well now. That leaves doing a trim in the front. Alright, I think we're in pretty good shape now. I did a light spray of shellac after scuffing it up. I will scuff it up again. I wanted to hit these curved areas especially because it's the most interesting, prominent feature of this cabinet. And let's be honest, it's a cheap cabinet. I'm sure they didn't go to these lengths when it was new, but I want to demonstrate some techniques, and it's a good candidate for that. Alright, so up till now we've been using shellac and grain filler. What I'm going to start moving on to now is lacquer, in particular Mohawk. Well, I think they're kind of the only game in town now when it comes to toner lacquer, but you can make your own. You can buy clear in a can, add dye to it, and if you have a spraying rig you can spray your own. But I especially like their clears, and they have a variety. So let's talk a little bit about this, somewhat controversial as to what sheen should you use. And it can be confusing, and even if you decide on gloss or semi-gloss, there's pre-catalyzed, there's non-pre-catalyzed, some don't specify, they're just lacquer. If you go to your home improvement center, let's see who else makes it, maybe Minwax, maybe one or two others, and it'll just say, they'll just have the luster, they won't tell you this part of it. What does that mean? Well, this is nitrocellulose based lacquer. It has to do with the chemical composition of the lacquer. There's lacquer and then there's lacquer. There's different chemicals that you can use, different types of solvents. So this is the type where it's solvent based, where the solvent evaporates and the molecules left behind bind together, polymerize, versus oil-based finishes where they oxidize and it actually reacts with the air and takes a while to set up. So that'd be what oil-based polyurethane or oil-based paints. These shellac lacquer, this is ethanol, this uses acetone, they need to evaporate, and then what's left kind of congeals and solidifies. The pre-catalyzing helps with that process. In layman's term, I'm not a chemist, but that's my understanding of the way it goes. It's good stuff. This is what you want to use if you can get it. Now, I don't specify in this, but I will tell you this. These smell different, and this seems to be more reactive. So what can happen, it's happened to me, is if I spray this right over what I have, it may react with what's already on there, in particular the grain filler. If when I scuff up the shellac, some of the grain filler gets exposed, this can react with it and actually make it dissolve a little bit or swell up and makes the surface rough. So what I'm going to do, and I suggest you do, before you put on this, just a light coating, whether it's semi-gloss, satin, gloss, do a light spritz of this before you put on that. And once you're done with this, we're only going to be using this. Now the sheen, I can almost guarantee you that everything was gloss when it was new. Back then, I don't even think they made anything but gloss. But it's 80 years later now, all the finishes have deteriorated, everything looks like satin or semi-gloss. So it's what we're used to seeing. So why would I think it's gloss? Well, and in cases where something has been protected, say it was behind closed doors or underneath a plaque or something, underneath knobs, it's definitely gloss. And from some photographic evidence, reading advertising brochures and whatnot, it seems like everything was glossy. And why wouldn't it be? They wanted this stuff that was shiny, it was new, it was supposed to be exciting, catch your eye. But nowadays, what do people want to see? It's old, it should look dull. However, there's two ways to do it. What we call semi-gloss or satin now with lacquer, they put stuff in it, flattening agents. It's really obvious if you look at a can of lacquer, it's cloudy. They put chemicals or additives to it to make it cloudy. I've heard some evidence that it actually weakens it. It makes it a poorer quality finish because you're contaminating it. But also, the more of it you put on, you're putting a cloudy finish over wood. You want to see the wood grain, you want it to be pretty. You put a clouding agent over it, it looks foggy depending on how you look. Somebody asked me if when I do this process, will the wood retain the shimmering effect, whereas when you change your viewing angle, it looks kind of cool 3D. If you use something like satin, flat, to a lesser extent semi-gloss, it will ruin that effect. However, you can use gloss and get a semi-gloss look by essentially scuffing it up when we're done. They call that rubbing out the finish. We'll talk more about that later, but I just want you to think about this. It's easier. Imagine if you don't run a refinishing shop, you just buy gloss. And afterwards, you can make it look like satin or semi-gloss if you want to, without too much effort. There's another step or two in the process that is going to be a little more work. Now, you've seen me use semi-gloss. I use semi-gloss when I'm putting new finish over old, because the old finish is already alligatored and scuffed up and dull looking. And using semi-gloss, I'm just putting a light coat or two over it to help protect it and seal it, make it look a little bit nicer. But when I'm refinishing, going down to bare bones, I almost always use gloss. That's what we're going to use. So I think this is in a pretty good state right now, so I'm going to do a light pass with this, and then we're going to see what we can do with the toner lacquer. Might as well talk about spraying technique while I'm doing it. Sorry about the cicadas and the AC in the background. It's just a noisy day. Generally I spray with the grain. It doesn't matter so much with this, but especially when you're putting on the toner. In case there's any inconsistencies in the amount of color that's getting put on, if you go with the grain, it'll be way less noticeable. About 10 inches away, I try to get a little bit closer and move faster if it's windy out, but this is all I'm doing. As far as do I go top to the bottom or bottom up, it really doesn't matter, except when you talk about overspray. It's a box. I can only spray one side at a time. As I'm spraying this side, some of it's going to travel over here and make the top rough. The surface that you care the most about, that people see the most, do that last. Because of any overspray that gets up here, when I spray this, will get melted in. But at this point, we're so early in the game, it doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to put a little light coating on it, so I'm just going all around. It's way too windy right now. I got to pause for a moment. It's a trade-off too. Why am I spraying out here where it's windy? Fumes, and and the lighting is fantastic. If I go in the garage, sure, I can eliminate the wind, but then the lighting isn't as good, and the ventilation isn't as good. So, a lot of trade-offs. Obviously, this isn't a professional setup. Not a professional refinisher. Yeah, see, it's too windy. Stuff's traveling too much. But that's the general process. Wait in between wind gusts and do the best you can. Now when we do the toner, that gets really tricky because you really don't want to have a wind gust go by when you're spraying this stuff on. So I may go into the garage for that and just deal with the lighting as best I can. Something else, having this surface horizontal versus vertical. For someone this doesn't matter so much. It's probably easier to do when it's vertical. Horizontal, you're putting it on a heavier coat, it'll flow out, get a nice flat surface. But then of course if anything lands on it, you got to deal with that. Vertical greatly reduces the chance of contamination landing on it. However, if you put it on too heavy, you're going to get runs. Generally, I do it vertical, and for the final pass on the top, I'll do it horizontal, and that I'll do in the garage or somewhere, or wait for there to be no wind. I'm just going to give you guys a quick taste of what toner looks like. I'm going to do the rest of it off camera so I can give it all my attention. Let's do a little on this box here, and I suggest you practice on some scrap wood. Shake it up well. The clear you don't have to shake up that well if you use the gloss, because there's nothing in it. It's just the lacquer and solvent, but this has pigment in it. It'll settle to the bottom, so you definitely want to shake it up. When you spray, I did a little bit here. I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna spray this unevenly on purpose so you can see what'll happen if you don't keep moving smoothly. So I hesitated there too long. What happened? I got darker and we have runs. Here I move faster, much lighter. Runs would be tragic at this point. You pretty much have to clear it off and start over in that area. If you get runs with clear, you can sand it and scrape it off and you can move on. But you have to get a consistent coating with this, or the color will not be consistent. The depth of color, the darkness of it won't be consistent. So I had to do more like that. I mean, then do multiple passes. And when you do them, see, we got unevenness here because I didn't hit this area. Then I will go back and I'll try to do the in-betweens. Also, the nozzles that come with this stuff, they're kind of Deft used to come with adjustable ones where you get a fan, and you can buy aftermarket ones. I actually bought some that graffiti artists use, where you can get a fan. Why would you want a fan spray? So these you get a cone, and the closer in, the less wide it is, and the further away it spreads out. With a fan, it will go, well, depending on how you orient the fan. If you do it this way, you get a thin line. But if you do it this way, you get a much wider swath. Easier to do a larger area with consistent coverage. But we'll deal with this because that's what people get off the shelf. So, and this is a small cabinet, so it's not that big a deal. So I'm just gonna start here. I'm just talking about doing this. And no, it's not dramatic. That's a good thing. That's a good thing because we're gonna do 3, 4, 5 passes. As I can see, there's less color here, a little more color there. So we'll just keep going over it. But also be careful. If you do this on a really, really bright day, you can deceive yourself and think, oh, it looks pretty good. You bring it inside, it's almost black because you put on so much. Again, experience. The kind of pass I did, I wouldn't do more than, say, 5 passes like that, or it's going to start getting a little too dark. There we go. Doing it in direct sunlight. This corner of the garage, with the door open, so I got ventilation, but so I could also see what I was doing. I'll have to bring it inside to know for sure. But it's an even color. The nice thing about this too is it's dry. Just a couple minutes and you're done. Versus stain having to wait a couple days. And this is just uniform color, so whatever this is, probably poplar, veneer, it's all the same color now. And yes, you definitely get that iridescence when you move your angle around. And this will look even better when we get the gloss on there. Here we are inside, and I think you can see it looks quite a bit darker. And I can also tell you, looking through the viewfinder versus in real life, it looks different. I found it's really hard to film and photograph cabinets refinishing tasks. It looks much better to me in person than it does through the viewfinder. Unfortunately, we'll see how it comes out in the final cut. I almost made it too dark. Now, how do I know? Because I'm surrounded by cabinets with the original finish. And it also looked redder outside than it does inside. And of course, it depends on the color temperature of your lighting and that kind of thing. I'll put on a bit more lights so you can get an even better look at it, and then we can talk about what comes next. So after the toner, I put on a few light coats of gloss. Now it's rough in areas because little bits of dust landed on it, and it did have some reaction with the underlying grain filler shellac layer. Even though it's a good sealer, inevitably it seems you get a little bit of reaction to it. So I will lightly sand this before I put on the next coats with 400 grit. Even though I know I said 220 is what you'd normally use. However, you'll see even if you use 400 or 600, you're going to get some color on it. Because with lacquer, the clear melts in with toner, and some of the toner diffuses up into the clear. So you got to be really, really, really careful at this stage what you do, because you do not want to remove too much color, or you're going to have a lighter area, and it's really, really difficult to put color back in and not screw it up. You could also keep putting on more clear before you do anything, but with the fuzzies and the contamination, it'll just, if you put subsequent layers, it's going to get harder and harder to get them out. It's best to do it as soon as you can in between coats. Well, as far as the overall look of it, did I get it right? Did I do a good job? Pretty much. The front was discolored from before, when I stripped it, because the finish was already gone here, and I think I mentioned there was maybe some UV damage or something, and that comes through because it's transparent color in the lacquer, so defects show through, but it's not too bad. You can see the rings where the knobs were, and I have no problem with that. That's fine. Overall, I'm quite happy with the results, especially on the curved area. I cared most about the patch. Yeah, I mean, if you were just walking by, I don't think you'd notice that at all. Not at all. The further you get away from certain angles, you don't even notice it. So I'm very happy with the way that worked out. And the grain foil did a good job. Everything looks to be really smooth. That's going to be really important when we get to the rubbing out stage. So I'm going to let this sit overnight. We don't have any rain in the forecast, I think, after a couple weeks of just horrific, humid, rainy, constant thunderstorm and tornado weather. So tomorrow, I hope I can do the light. I'll do light sanding tonight, maybe, and then first thing tomorrow, put on some more coats, and maybe at the end of the day, put on some more coats, and that might be enough. Here it is after the second pass of clear gloss lacquer. We're between the first and second. Light sanding with 220. It's looking really, really nice. Hard to capture on camera just how pretty that is, I think. Now, we could stop right here and call it done. I think I'll put on one more coat, and then I could call it done. However, there are a few more things we can do, which we're going to talk about in the next part. Give you a quick preview. One, well, we should protect this no matter at what stage we stop. We should put something on this, wax, oil, and it should be done, reapplied periodically to help protect this. But there's also something that can be done called rubbing it out. You may have seen, especially on high-end radio cabinets, where they talk about a hand-rubbed finish. That's what we're going to do next time. That's it for now. Thanks for watching.